In the winter of 1429, a 17-year-old girl with no military training, no formal education, and no family connections walked into the court of the future King of France and told him she had been sent by God to save his kingdom. He could have had her removed, he could have laughed. Instead, he gave her an army. Within 4 months, she had done something that France's most experienced military commanders had failed to do for years. She broke the Siege of Orléans. She reversed the tide of a war that had been running for nearly a century, and she did it before she turned 18. This is the story of Joan of Arc. To understand what she did, you first need to understand the world she was born into, because France in 1412 was not the France of palaces and culture that most people imagine. It was a country that had been at war with England for 75 years, losing steadily, losing catastrophically, losing in ways that made ordinary French people wonder if God had abandoned them entirely. At the time of Joan of Arc's birth, France had been racked by 90 years of conflict and was almost at a point of desperation in the aptly named 100 Years' War. The English had won the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 in one of the most complete military humiliations in French history. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes had handed the French throne to the English king, essentially declaring France a conquered nation. The French Dauphin, the man who should have been Charles VII, had been disinherited, mocked, and driven south of the Loire River with what remained of his court and his dignity, which was not much of either. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris, controlled the north, and were tightening their grip around the last remaining French-held city of strategic importance, a city called Orléans, the city that stood between England and the complete conquest of France. Into this world of collapse and occupation, on January 6, 1412, Joan of Arc was born in the village of Domremy in northeast France to a poor but deeply pious peasant family. Her father Jacques was a farmer. Her mother Isabelle taught her prayers. She took special pride in spinning and sewing. She never learned to read or write. Domremy itself was a village on the fault line of the war. Burgundian raiders attacked it regularly. Joan grew up watching her village burned, hearing of French defeats, and absorbing from her earliest years the conviction that something was deeply, spiritually wrong with the world she had been born into. She was not a girl who was sheltered from the war. The war came to her door. When she was about 12 or 13, she started to see visions and hear voices of figures that she identified as Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. At first, she told no one. The voices were personal. She kept them inside her for years, tending her family's livestock, spinning thread, going to church, being by every outward measure an entirely ordinary peasant girl in an entirely ordinary village. But the voices grew louder and more specific and more insistent. In May 1428, her voices told her to go to the King of France and help him reconquer his kingdom. She was 16 years old. She could not read. She had never left her village. She had never held a sword. And she was being told to go and meet the heir to the French throne, tell him God had sent her, and lead his armies to victory. Most people, hearing voices telling them something like this, would have done nothing. Joan of Arc started making plans. Her first attempt to be heard failed immediately. She traveled to Vaucouleurs, the nearest stronghold loyal to the Dauphin, and presented herself to the captain of the garrison, Robert de Baudricourt. Baudricourt told Joan's cousin who had brought her, "Take her home to her father and give her a good whipping." She went home, and then she came back. In January 1429, she returned to Vaucouleurs and presented herself to Baudricourt a second time. Something about her had changed, or perhaps something about the situation had. After she told him of a defeat of the king's army outside of Orléans, a fact Baudricourt learned a few days later, and something that Joan could not possibly have known by herself, he allowed Joan to visit the king. What followed was one of the most remarkable journeys in medieval history. Joan and a small escort of 6 men rode approximately 350 miles across enemy-controlled territory in 11 days, in February, in winter, at night, to reach the Dauphin's court at Chinon. They crossed rivers that were flooded. They rode through Burgundian territory, where capture would have meant death. They arrived in Chinon on February 23, 1429, and Joan asked to see the Dauphin. The Dauphin Charles was not an impressive figure. He was 25 years old, uncertain, unprepossessing, and so doubtful of his own legitimacy that he had spent years in a psychological paralysis that matched the military one gripping his kingdom. He is reported to have tested Joan by disguising himself among his courtiers to see if she could identify him. She walked directly to him in a crowded room. Whether this was divine insight or simply a sharp and observant girl reading a court full of signals, nobody who was there could say. What they agreed on was that it worked. Charles was shaken. He did not immediately hand her an army. He was not reckless. He sent her to Poitiers, where a panel of theologians examined her for 3 weeks, questioning her about her visions, her faith, her character. They found no evidence of demonic influence and no reason to reject her claims. She returned to Chinon with something she had not had before, official approval. Now Charles had to decide what to do with her. He gave her armor. He gave her a banner which she had designed herself, white with golden lilies and the words Jesus Maria upon it. He gave her the title of chef de guerre, head of war, and he gave her an army to relieve the Siege of Orléans. She did not look like what armies expected to follow. She was a girl of 17, stocky and strong by contemporary accounts, with her hair cut short in the practical manner she had adopted for war. She wore white armor from head to foot. She carried a banner rather than a weapon because, she said, she did not wish to kill anyone, though she was present in every battle that followed. The soldiers who rode with her initially regarded her with a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and the grudging willingness of men who had been losing for a long time to try something completely different. The Siege of Orléans had begun on October 12, 1428, and represented the military turning point of the 100 Years' War between France and England. The English had besieged the city for over 6 months. The city's defenders were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly hopeless. If Orléans fell, the road south to the Dauphin's remaining territory would be open. France as an independent kingdom would effectively be over. On April 29, as a French sortie distracted the English troops on the west side of the city, Joan entered unopposed by its eastern gate. Bringing needed supplies and troops into the besieged city, she also inspired the French to a passionate resistance and through the next week led the charge during a number of skirmishes and battles. On one occasion she was even hit by an arrow, but after dressing her wounds she returned to the battle. The French commanders, shaken and beginning to consider calling off the attack for the day, were preparing to withdraw. Joan returned. She rode back to the front of the assault and led the final charge herself. The Tourelles fell. The English commander Glasdale drowned in the Loire, pulled down by the weight of his own armor. On May 8th, the English retreated from Orléans. The siege had lasted over 6 months. Joan had been inside the city for 9 days. The impact on French morale was immediate and electric. The English commander John, Duke of Bedford, wrote to the English king that the French had recovered their spirits by, in his own words, the hand of a disciple and limb of the fiend. He could not bring himself to credit it to a human girl. He attributed it to the devil. This itself tells you something. The English were not dismissing what had happened at Orléans. They were terrified by it and looking for explanations. During the next 5 weeks, Joan led French forces into a number of stunning victories over the English, and Reims, the traditional city of coronation, was captured in July. The Loire campaign swept English forces out of town after town. Jargeau fell. Meung surrendered. Bégency was retaken. At each battle, Joan was at the front, not directing from a safe distance, at the front. At Reims, Joan had no artillery or siege equipment, but advised, "Advance boldly and fear nothing." The city yielded without a fight, and on July 16, 1429, the Dauphin was officially crowned Charles VII, King of France. Joan knelt before the king and said that she had accomplished what God had ordered of her. The only personal favor she asked was that her village of Domremy be exempted from taxes. It was. She was homesick. She wanted to go home and tend her father's sheep. That was all she said she wanted. It was never to be. The months after the coronation were harder. Charles VII, now crowned and feeling more secure, was cautious where Joan wanted to press the advantage. An attempt to retake Paris in September 1429 failed. Joan was wounded in the thigh during the assault. Political intrigues at court began to complicate everything. The momentum of the summer victories slowed, and the people who resented her influence, who found the idea of a peasant girl directing military strategy offensive and politically threatening, began working against her. In May 1430, the Burgundians laid siege to Compiègne, and Joan stole into the town under the cover of darkness to aid in its defense. On May 23rd, while leading a sortie against the Burgundians, she was captured. The exact circumstances of her capture have been debated ever since. What is known is that when the drawbridge of Compiègne was raised behind retreating French troops, Joan was left on the outside. She was pulled from her horse by Burgundian soldiers. Charles VII, the king she had crowned, made no serious attempt to ransom her. The Burgundians sold her to the English, and in March 1431 she went on trial before ecclesiastical authorities in Rouen on charges of heresy. Her most serious crime, according to the tribunal, was her rejection of church authority in favor of direct inspiration from God. The trial was presided over by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a committed Burgundian ally who had a personal stake in her conviction. The English immediately initiated a political show trial for heresy, intending to invalidate Charles's kingship by proving Joan was sent by the devil. The trial lasted 4.5 months. Joan faced her accusers alone, without a legal advisor, without anyone in that courtroom who was there to help her. She had no education. She could not read the documents placed before her, and yet the transcripts of her trial, which survive in full and represent one of the most extraordinary historical documents of the medieval period, show a young woman whose answers were so precise, so clever, and so theologically careful that her questioners frequently struggled to find grounds to condemn her. When asked whether she was in a state of grace, a question designed to trap her because claiming to be in God's grace was presumptuous but denying it was heresy, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The court had no answer for that. After refusing to submit to the church, her sentence was read. She was to be turned over to secular authorities and executed. Reacting with horror to the pronouncement, "Mon in âme," Joan agreed to recant and was condemned instead to perpetual imprisonment. Ordered to put on women's clothes, she obeyed. But a few days later, the judges went to her cell and found her dressed again in male attire. She was declared a relapsed heretic. The reason she gave for resuming male clothing was that her women's clothing had been taken by guards and she had no other option. She also said her voices had told her she had been wrong to recant. She was 19 years old. She knew what was coming. On Wednesday morning, May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen's marketplace. She was not yet 20 years old. Her ashes were cast into the Seine River to prevent her followers from recovering them as relics. An English soldier watching the execution reportedly said afterward that they had burned a saint. A secretary to the English king wrote that the king had lost much, for she was burned through great hatred. Even in victory, her enemies seemed to sense that they had not won anything at all. In 1456, the nullification trial concluded with a finding that Joan was wrongfully executed. The verdict that had burned her was declared null and void. Everything she had been condemned for was posthumously cleared. She was beatified by Pope Pius X in 1909 and canonized by Pope Benedict XV on May 16, 1920. The Maid of Orleans was only 19 years old when the English burned her alive, but such is her fame that there are more than 20,000 books about her in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. She is the patron saint of France. She appears in the works of Shakespeare, Voltaire, Schiller, Mark Twain, George Bernard Shaw, and Bertolt Brecht, among hundreds of others. But strip away all of that and what you have is this: a girl who could not read, who had never left her village, who heard something inside herself that told her the world was wrong and that she was supposed to fix it, who walked into the presence of kings and refused to be dismissed, who led armies into battle at 17, who broke a siege in 9 days that had lasted 6 months, who reversed the course of a 100-year war, who faced her execution at 19 with more composure than most people in that courtroom would have managed at twice her age. She was not born into power, she did not inherit it, she did not marry into it. She claimed it from nothing, using only the certainty of her own conviction and the willingness to walk toward what frightened everyone else. That is why, 600 years later, the world has not finished talking about her.